I'll never forget the chill in my grandfather's office, even though it was the middle of summer. The ink on the will that made my father $56 million richer was barely dry, and his first official act wasn't one of mourning, but of cold, clean severance. He slid a small cardboard box across the mahogany desk, the same desk my grandfather taught me to sketch on, and said, "Security will escort you out. We can't have you leaving with any company property." In his moment of triumph, I was just a liability to be removed. But he never bothered to read the fine print, the one clause my grandfather left behind that would bring him to my door, begging, less than 24 hours later. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Madison, and I was raised in a world of blueprints and brick dust, taught from a very young age that the soul of a building lies in its foundation. It was a lesson imparted not in a classroom, but on windswept construction sites, with the scent of wet earth and steel in the air. My grandfather, Samuel Hawthorne, was my teacher. He was a legend in the world of architecture and real estate, a man who could see a cathedral in a vacant lot, the kind of visionary who built not just structures, but landmarks. He founded the Hawthorne legacy with calloused hands and a poet's heart, believing that buildings were more than just shelters. They were the silent witnesses to human lives, shelters for our dreams, our sorrows, and our triumphs. He'd often take me with him as a little girl, my small hand lost in his. He'd unroll a massive blueprint on the hood of his old Ford truck, the paper crackling in the breeze, and trace the lines with a knowing finger. "You see this? Maddie," he'd say, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "This isn't just a wall. This is the line that separates the chaos of the world from the peace of a home. This isn't just a window, it's an invitation for the morning sun." He taught me that every line had a purpose, every material, a story, a structure, like a person, must have good bones. He'd always say, "But it's the heart that truly makes it a home." My father, Preston, never understood that language for him. A foundation was a line item on a budget sheet, a problem of load-bearing capacity and cost per square foot. The soul of a building was its profit margin. As the chief executive officer of the Hawthorne legacy, a title Samuel had bestowed upon him years ago in a hopeful, perhaps naive, attempt to instill a sense of stewardship. He operated in a world of spreadsheets and stock prices. He was a brilliant financial mind, but he was tone-deaf to the music of creation. He viewed my grandfather's artisanal, quality-first approach as a charming but inefficient relic of a bygone era. Our company wasn't a legacy to be nurtured. It was a portfolio of assets to be leveraged, stripped, and sold to the highest bidder. My world was the design studio. It was a sun-drenched loft on the top floor of the Hawthorne building, a space my grandfather had designed for my mother, Eleanor, years ago. She had been a painter, a woman whose spirit was as vibrant and untamed as the abstract canvases she produced. The studio was filled with her lingering presence, the faint scent of turpentine, the colorful paint splatters on the old hardwood floors. She'd been the bridge in our family, the one who could translate my grandfather's artistic soul for my father's pragmatic mind. But she was taken by a sudden illness when I was in college, a fierce and mercifully brief battle that left a permanent void. With her passing, the bridge between the two men in my life collapsed, leaving my grandfather and me on one side of a chasm, and my father alone on the other. As the company's chief architect, I had inherited her studio and, in many ways, her role as the keeper of the creative flame. It was my team's designs that graced the covers of architectural magazines and won the industry awards that Preston proudly accepted on the company's behalf. He would stand at podiums, bathed in the flash of cameras, and speak eloquently of our enduring vision. But in the cold light of the boardroom, he referred to my division as the Arts and Crafts Department. I was a useful asset, a tool for generating good press and attracting high-end clients who valued the Hawthorne name, but I was never, in his eyes, essential. Our dynamic was a long, slow-burning fire of unspoken resentments. I saw his focus on short-term profit as a betrayal of his father's life's work. He saw my dedication to craftsmanship and sustainability as a frivolous and expensive indulgence. We circled each other for years, our disagreements masked by a thin veneer of corporate professionalism. The peace was kept only by the unwavering presence of my grandfather, whose quiet authority was the one force my father still, however reluctantly, respected. The first tremor of the coming earthquake arrived on a Tuesday morning. The main boardroom was an imposing space, all dark mahogany and polished chrome, with a panoramic view of the city we had helped build. I was presenting the culmination of 2 years of my life, a detailed proposal for the Aria Arts Complex, a sustainable, multi-use community hub that Samuel and I had poured our hearts into. It was more than a building, it was a statement, a gift back to the city, designed to be a living, breathing space for generations to come. I spoke with a fire in my belly, my voice clear and steady as I walked the board through the renderings, the environmental impact studies, the community outreach results. I laid out a vision of a place that would not only be profitable in the long run, but would also enrich the cultural fabric of the city. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe I could make them see, even my father. He let me finish my 40-minute presentation without interruption. When I was done, a polite, sterile applause filled the room. Preston stood up, that placid, unreadable smile fixed on his face. He walked to the front of the room, picked up one of the beautiful hand-drawn renderings my team had spent weeks perfecting, and held it up as if admiring it. "This is beautiful work, Madison," he conceded, his voice smooth and patronizing. "Truly, the kind of thing that gets you on the cover of a magazine. It would make a lovely centerpiece for a university campus." He paused, letting the faint praise hang in the air before delivering the killing blow. He gently rolled up the rendering and placed it deliberately on the corner of the table. "A symbolic piece of trash, however," he continued, his voice hardening into the familiar cadence of command. "We are not a university. We are a business, and this business requires a predictable return on investment, not just feel-good press. Madison, I think it's time you refocused your team's considerable talents on something more practical. The interiors for the new line of luxury condos. For instance, leave the larger corporate strategy to those of us who have to answer to our shareholders." The room was suffocatingly silent. I could feel the eyes of the board members on me, a mixture of pity and discomfort. He hadn't just rejected my project. He had publicly infantilized me, reducing my role from chief architect to a mere decorator. It was a calculated display of power, a clear signal that the moment my grandfather was gone, my influence would be gone with him. I gathered my presentation materials with shaking hands, my face burning with a humiliation so profound it felt like a physical blow. A few months later, my grandfather's strength began to wane. The cancer he had fought into a long remission years ago had returned. A silent and aggressive thief, the grand old estate on the hill, once a place of lively debates and roaring fireplaces, grew quiet. Its rhythm slowed to the gentle ticking of the tall case clock in the foyer and the soft, rhythmic hum of the oxygen machine by Samuel's bedside. I put my life on hold and moved back into my childhood bedroom, the familiar floral wallpaper a comforting sight. I set up a drafting table in the adjacent guest room, its window overlooking my grandfather's beloved rose garden, and tried to maintain a semblance of work while being available for his every need. My days became a quiet routine of medications, soft-cooked meals, and shared silence. Some days, we would just sit together, his frail hand in mine, and watch the birds at the feeder outside his window. On other days, when he had the strength, we would talk for hours. He never spoke of fear or regret. Instead, he spoke of life, of love, of the unshakable principles that had guided him. He told me stories of the company's early days, of the handshake deals and the impossible deadlines, of the time he personally paid a carpenter's medical bills when his insurance lapsed. "A company is just a community of people. Maddie," he whispered, his voice reedy but clear. "You take care of your people, and the business will take care of itself." He gave me his old, worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. The leather cover softened by decades of use. Its pages were filled with his elegant, spidery handwriting notes in the margins, underlined passages, thoughts, and questions. It was his way of passing down his true inheritance, the blueprint for a life well lived, a foundation of integrity and quiet strength. Preston's visits were a daily intrusion. He would stride into the sick room, his expensive shoes silent on the antique Persian rugs, bringing with him the cold, sterile air of the financial district. He didn't bring comfort. He brought documents. He would sit by Samuel's bed, his voice a low, urgent murmur, discussing contract negotiations, acquisitions, and fourth quarter projections. He saw his father's final days not as a precious, fleeting time for connection, but as a critical window for a transfer of power. He was a man trying to secure his throne before the reigning monarch took his last breath. He brought lawyers to the house, men in sharp suits with cold eyes. For a few quick signatures, he would probe the hospice nurse, a kind and patient woman named Maria, with questions about my grandfather's lucidity and cognitive state. Maria, to her credit, would answer with professional brevity, her eyes betraying a deep disapproval of his methods. I knew he was building a case, creating a paper trail to ensure his control was absolute and unchallengeable. The final, unforgivable act came one evening when I was in the kitchen, preparing my grandfather's broth. I heard Preston's voice from the library, where he often took his business calls. The door was ajar, and his words, though spoken in a hushed tone, sliced through the quiet house like shards of glass. "The board is getting anxious," he said, his voice laced with a familiar impatience. "But they need to hold their nerve. I've spoken with Sterling's people, and the offer is solid. Once the estate is settled and I have full control, we'll have the controlling shares we need to push through the sale of the waterfront properties. Her little art project will be the first thing to go. It's a complete waste of prime, developable real estate. Real." I stood frozen by the stove, the ladle trembling in my hand. Sterling. He was talking to James Sterling, a notorious corporate raider known for buying historic companies, stripping them of their assets, and selling off the pieces. My father wasn't just planning to change the company's direction. He was planning to execute it. He was plotting to sell his own father's life's work for parts before Samuel was even gone. The cold-blooded nature of the betrayal was staggering. It wasn't business. It was patricide in slow motion. Samuel passed away on a Sunday morning, as peacefully as a man can. The first light of dawn was painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gold, and I was holding his hand, whispering to him about a dream I'd had about a building made of light. I felt his grip loosen, a final, gentle release. The silence that followed was the loudest, most definitive sound I had ever heard. After calling Maria, my next call, the one I dreaded, was to Preston. He arrived within the hour, his face a mask of somber duty. His first question was not about his father's final moments. It was, did he say anything about the business before the funeral home had even been contacted? He was in Samuel's study, his hands rifling through the mahogany desk drawers. "I need to find the will," he said, more to himself than to me. "We need to know exactly where things stand." The funeral was a testament to the man Samuel had been. The grand old cathedral was overflowing. I saw carpenters and electricians he'd employed 30 years ago, standing shoulder to shoulder with captains of industry. I saw the young architects he'd mentored, their faces etched with a grief that was both personal and professional. They had lost not just a friend, but a guiding star. My eulogy was a patchwork of memories, a tribute to the grandfather who taught me to see beauty in a stack of lumber and purpose in a line on a page. Preston's eulogy was a masterclass in corporate doublespeak. He spoke of market share, growth, and shareholder value. He mourned Samuel Hawthorne, the CEO, the icon, the brand. He never once mentioned Samuel Hawthorne, his father. The will reading was scheduled for the next day. We gathered in the formal, wood-paneled conference room of Mr. Caldwell, a man as old and dignified as the law firm that bore his name. He had been Samuel's lawyer, his confidant, and his closest friend for over 50 years. The atmosphere was heavy, the air thick with unspoken expectations. I sat beside Preston, feeling a strange and distant dread. Mister. Caldwell adjusted his spectacles and began to read from the thick cream-colored document. The language was dense, a forest of legal clauses, but the core message was brutally simple. With a few minor bequests to longtime staff and a generous donation to the university's School of Architecture, the entirety of the Hawthorne Legacy, the company, the properties, the stocks, the art, the $56 million empire was bequeathed to his beloved and only son, Preston Hawthorne. My name was not mentioned, not as a beneficiary, not as a board member, not even in passing. It was a complete and total erasure. A cold wave of shock washed over me, so intense it felt like drowning. I had never expected a fortune, but I had, somewhere in the foolish, hopeful part of my heart, expected to be acknowledged. To be erased felt like the final, ultimate rejection. Preston's face was a study in practiced solemnity, but I could see the glint of absolute triumph in his eyes. He had won. The kingdom was his, without caveat or condition. As we stood to leave, "Mister?" Caldwell approached him, holding a thick blue leather-bound folder. It was a duplicate of the will, containing all the intricate trust agreements and codicils. "Preston, Mister," Caldwell said, his voice grave and weighted. "This is the complete estate document. It is complex. I strongly advise you to sit down with your legal team and review it, page by page." My father, already inhabiting his new role as absolute monarch, waved a dismissive hand. "I'm sure it's all standard boilerplate, Henry," he said, his tone casual and condescending. "I've got the gist of it. Just have your office send an executive summary to my legal team. I'm far too busy dealing with the transition to get bogged down in paperwork." He never even touched the folder. That single act of supreme arrogance was his undoing. He then turned to me, the thin veneer of familial connection gone, replaced by the cold, impersonal efficiency of a corporate restructuring. "Madison," he began, his voice flat, "given the new, aggressive direction I'll be taking the company, your role as chief architect has become redundant. Your design philosophy, while admirable, is more aligned with my father's era. It's a sentimental luxury we can no longer afford." He said it so calmly, so matter-of-factly, as if he were discontinuing an unprofitable product line. "I'll need you to clear out your office by the end of the day," he continued, his eyes focused somewhere over my shoulder. "Human resources will handle the formalities of your severance package, and to avoid any potential conflicts of interest, security will escort you from the premises. We can't have any intellectual property accidentally walking out the door." The rest of the day passed in a surreal, painful blur. I packed 20 years of my life, my sketches, my models, my awards, a framed photo of Samuel and me at my graduation into a single generic cardboard box. Derek, a rival architect whom my father had always favored, was already in my office with a measuring tape, planning his new layout. He had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. My father, on the other hand, felt nothing. True to his word, 2 guards from building security men who had watched me grow up, who had always asked about my grandfather, waited politely by my door. They couldn't meet my eyes. They walked me through the building, a silent, humiliating procession past my former colleagues, who were frozen at their desks, pretending to be absorbed in their work. I was an exile in my own home. I drove to my small, anonymous rental apartment and sat on the floor amidst the relics of my former life. The grief for my grandfather, which I had been holding at bay, now crashed over me, mingled with the raw, acute pain of betrayal. It wasn't about the money. It was about the erasure. It was about being told, in the most definitive way possible, that I did not matter. I must have sat there for hours, lost in a fog of despair. When my phone finally rang, the sound was a jarring intrusion. It was an unknown number, and I almost ignored it. But some instinct, some flicker of a forgotten hope, made me answer. It was Mr. Caldwell's office, his assistant, her voice imbued with a new and urgent tone, requested my immediate presence. It is a matter of the utmost importance regarding the final disposition of the Hawthorne estate, she said, confused and emotionally numb. I drove back through the darkening city streets. Mr. Caldwell greeted me not in the formal conference room, but in his private study, a warm, inviting space that smelled of old leather and pipe tobacco, just like my grandfather's. His expression was one of profound sympathy, but there was something else in his eyes, too, a spark of anticipation. Your grandfather was a brilliant man, Madison, he began, his voice soft, but more than that, he was a masterful student of human nature. He knew his son. He hoped for the best in him, but he planned for the worst. He then slid a tablet across the polished surface of his desk. A video file was open. He recorded this 2 months ago, Meister, Caldwell explained. He gave me explicit instructions. I was to show this to you, and only you, in the event that Preston acted to remove you from your position at the company. My hand trembled as I pressed the play icon. Samuel's face, etched with the lines of age and illness but illuminated by his indomitable spirit, filled the screen. He was in his study, the afternoon light streaming in behind him. He smiled, a sad, knowing smile that broke my heart all over again. He spoke directly to the camera, as if he could see me sitting there. He explained everything. The document that had been read aloud that morning was a conditional will. It was merely part one of a meticulous 2-part estate plan he had crafted with Mr. Caldwell over the last year. Preston's inheritance, all $56 million of it, was entirely contingent upon him, demonstrating a fundamental respect for the creative and familial legacy of the company. The condition was specific, ironclad, and legally unambiguous. Within 72 hours of the reading of the will, he was required to publicly affirm my role and title as chief architect and managing partner of the Hawthorne legacy. By firing you, my brilliant Madison, Samuel's voice said from the screen, his gaze unwavering, by attempting to erase your vital contribution from the company's future. He has triggered the nullification clause. He has, in his haste and his greed, voided the very document that gave him everything. I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. The video continued, my grandfather's voice a sorrowful but resolute final judgment. Upon such a violation, he declared, Part 1 of my last will and testament is rendered legally void. In its place, Part 2, my true and final testament, is to be enacted immediately. The executor is instructed to file it with the probate court at the start of business tomorrow. Mr. Caldwell paused the video and produced a second, heavy envelope, its wax seal bearing the Hawthorne family crest. This, Madison, he said, his voice imbued with the weight of the moment as he broke the seal, is Part 2. It is quite simple. He unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It states that all assets, properties, and controlling shares of the Hawthorne legacy are to be transferred into a single irrevocable trust, and the sole trustee and beneficiary of that trust is you. Less than 24 hours after being thrown out on the street, I returned to the headquarters of the Hawthorne legacy. I was not a disgraced ex-employee seeking revenge. I was its legal owner, armed with the full and final power of my grandfather's will. Mr. Caldwell was by my side, a silent, formidable pillar of legal authority. The emergency board meeting I had called was about to begin. We walked into the boardroom just as my father was in the middle of a passionate speech, laying out his new aggressive vision for the company, a vision that involved, as I had feared, the immediate sale of the waterfront properties to the Sterling Group. His back was to the door, and he didn't see us enter. The look on his face when he turned and saw me, flanked by the estate's executor, was a sight I will never forget. It was a chaotic kaleidoscope of confusion, fury, and a dawning, gut-wrenching horror. Mr. Caldwell, without a word, placed a copy of the second will and the signed affidavits documenting the violation of the first will at each board member's seat. The silence in the room was absolute. The transfer of power was ironclad and legally indisputable. The empire Preston had held for a single day had vanished, undone by his own hand. He followed me back to my Mydwar office, the one I'd been forced to vacate the day before. The box of my personal belongings was still by the door where a janitor had left it. He closed the door behind him, and the dam of his composure finally broke. He begged, he pleaded. He tried to reason, to threaten, to gaslight. He appealed to a father-daughter bond he had never bothered to forge. He offered me partnerships, titles, a figurehead role, anything to maintain a foothold in the company he had just lost. I listened to it all. And when the storm of his desperation had finally exhausted itself, I looked at him, not with hatred, but with a quiet, sad clarity. The greatest inheritance grandfather left me wasn't the company or the money, I told him, my voice steady and even. It was his integrity. He taught me what it means to build something that lasts, and that is not for sale. I then picked up my office phone and buzzed the front desk. "Please send security up to the executive suite," I said calmly. "My father is finished with his business here, and he needs to be escorted from the building." As I stood alone in the vast office, the city lights twinkling to life outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, I felt the immense weight of the legacy settle onto my shoulders. It was a heavy weight, but it was not a burden. It was a foundation. My grandfather had given me the tools, the vision, and the ultimate opportunity. Now, it was my turn to build.